So today we're going over a series that I particularly enjoy, and that is going to be the Dead Space series. Now, we're going over mainly the books in this video, but this series is unique in the fact that there's no duplication amongst products as far as storytelling is concerned. I've never seen another series do this where they'll take one format and tell a part of the story and then hop into a different format and tell another part of the story and so on and so forth. The main series that is Dead Space is actually told in the form of a video game series. That's Dead Space 1, 2, and 3. And then there's a couple of animated movies that tell different parts of the stories. Then you have a selection of books that tell other parts of the story, but there literally is no overlap. You don't have any duplication. There's no adaptations or anything like that. Each format tells a different part of the story entirely. Now, to start off this little review here, I'm going to start off with this book right here. And this is basically a limited edition guidebook to the video game Dead Space 2. And it has a lot of stuff to do with each of the chapters of the game and all that stuff as far as how to go through it, what the map layouts are, and everything like that. But what I mainly got it for and what I really enjoy is towards the back of the book, you have, like with in another video I've done before, it has a lot of concept art along with, all the architecture of the scenes and everything, as well as the different suit designs that you have for the character of Isaac Clarke, which is the main character of the Dead Space franchise. And I really love just the artwork and the creature design of the necromorphs and everything. So more on what Dead Space actually is. So in the main series, you follow a character named Isaac Clarke, who is an engineer who basically gets thrust into this survival horror science fiction story. And you're dealing with these creatures that bear a resemblance to zombies, but are so much worse. Honestly, what necromorphs are make zombies look like a bunch of cute kittens. Let's be real. Because it's not just a simple headshot that takes care of these things, but you have to literally render them immobile by removing appendages. And Isaac has a various selection of tools for the trade that he can use to accomplish that goal in order to survive. Now, what I enjoy more so about Dead Space is not just the scenery and locations. In fact, with Dead Space 2, where that takes place, is one of my favorite locations in the Dead Space universe. Like, it's such a fascinating location just to stare at from the outside and on the inside. It's quite literally a space city floating in outer space attached to the last remaining shard of what used to be Saturn's moon Titan. And if you know the lore of Dead Space, that's where the very first planet crack took place in order to mine it for its resources. And just a whole sprawling city just grew from that location. And it's just very fascinating from a scientific standpoint and just from an aesthetic standpoint. Love that kind of stuff. But the lore of Dead Space is quite fascinating too. All of it is centered around an artifact known as a marker, which is what you see right here. This is a little 3D print I got from Etsy.com, and I really enjoy it. So basically, the story goes is one of these markers was discovered on planet Earth in the Yucatan, underneath the Yucatan Peninsula, which is allegedly where the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs landed. So the theory is that this marker arrived on the planet via that asteroid and somehow forced evolution on the planet to create the human race. And basically, it sends out a pulsing signal. And this signal has an effect on people's minds and on deceased tissue. More on that later. But basically, depending on who is affected by it, because some people are immune to the signal, some people are driven insane by it, and others see it in the form of codes in order to, or more so, blueprints. That way they can manufacture more markers and spread them across the planet. And so basically, you got this thing affecting people's minds and influencing them towards a certain specific goal. And that basically created two different factions, if you will. You have the government who is doing research on it, trying to make more and use it for limitless energy purposes because the marker gives off so much energy when it pulses. It gives off the temptation, just the prospect that it might be a source of clean, limitless energy. And then, of course, you have the greed factor in there. But the other side of it is a religion called unitology, which is based off of the markers. And they have a prophet, goes by the name of Michael Altman, who allegedly created this religion based around the markers. And they move towards a goal known as convergence, which is a day kind of similar to the rapture of Christianity. It's their day where everybody will finally come together and become one being, one mind, one soul kind of thing. But it's basically got the makings of a cult, let's be real. And so basically, Isaac finds himself in the middle of a war between these two factions in order to fight for control of the markers and all this other stuff. But little do they know, the markers are sentient enough to have their own plans, and it's all going according to their plan. And so now on the point of the marker's effect on dead tissue, if it's surrounded by enough people and biomass, if you will, for a certain amount of time, it can actually reanimate dead tissue. And that's where the necromorphs come in. You have dead corpses becoming these zombie like creatures, which are in turn going around killing everybody that hasn't already killed themselves from being driven insane by the marker's signal, and basically allowing for more dead tissue to be created and molded into more necromorphs. And what's really crazy about the necromorphs is that you can actually pile up multiple dead bodies and they can become one necromorph and cause even more damage. And the signal basically travels from the marker to the larger necromorphs through to the smaller necromorphs in a hive mind sort of fashion. So, as you can see from what all I've laid out so far, there is a whole lot of world building and lore to this universe, and I love that stuff. But yeah, this is definitely a good book to get a hold of. I highly recommend. Very rich in lore and all kinds of just backstory on so many characters and different groups and factions. It's just a really fascinating story. But I definitely wouldn't hop into the games or the movies if you have a sensitive stomach. I'll just put it like that. But moving on to the next book in this review is Dead Space Martyr. Now, this takes place during the time of when the original marker was actually discovered. So, this is Michael Altman's time, that prophet I mentioned earlier of unitology. So, basically, he is a scientist and he is employed by the government in order to go and study this artifact. And you, through reading other parts of the books and going through the games and the movies and whatnot, you learn that, Michael Altman founded Unitology and did all these things. But in the book, you learn that there might be some details that we didn't previously know about, and it makes you question everything that we've known up to this point. And you just learn just how capable the government is at covering up certain things and reshaping storylines. And then you also get the backstory of how unitology actually was created in order for it to become the problem for our protagonist about a couple of 100 years later, roughly, give or take. Because this one takes place around near somewhat the year 2214, I believe. Whereas Isaac Clarke's story, our main character, his story takes place around 2514 ish, give or take. Um, so that's all on that book right there. The next book I have here is Dead Space Catalyst. Now, this takes place after Dead Space Martyr, but still a significant amount of time before Dead Space 1 of the video game series where you're introduced to Isaac Clarke. And this follows the story of two brothers. And the oldest brother is the main character. He has a younger brother who's special needs, but as you progress through the story, you find out that it was less so that he was special needs and more so that he was actually under the influence of the marker signal at the time. And it just wreaked havoc on his psychological state. Someone who was already unstable to a certain degree. And it's through this story that you learn that there were more markers out and about in space than what we already knew about. And that there's several government outposts amongst the stars and different star systems that have markers in their labs, and they're studying them, learning how to replicate and harness them. And this is during the time of the Sovereign Colonies government. And the government during Isaac's time is EarthGov. And so you kind of get a little taste of the story on how the sovereign colonies fell and the measures they took to cover up their experiments so nobody would ever find them. But you, through this story, discover the locations of at least one, possibly more, of the sister markers to the marker that is discovered in Isaac's time, which is a red marker. And that marker that Isaac deals with was always known as marker 3A. So we're like, oh, okay, so possibly there's a marker 1A and 2A, and you actually encounter one or two of those in this book here. So it's really quite fascinating just to see how expansive this world is. But I won't spoil any more on that book in case you decide to get it for yourself. So the next one here is actually a graphic novel called Dead Space Salvage. And this takes place almost immediately after the events of Dead Space 1. And you're following a group that is known as the Magpies. Now, what the Magpies are in the Dead Space universe are basically freelance groups of people that may or may not be running from the law, basically searching the stars for minerals and salvage, things that they can make a quick buck on and go about their lives pretty much. So they're not exactly sanctioned by any one group, but they end up through one of their jobs that they're having to do, encountering the ship that Isaac was stranded on during Dead Space 1. And you find it in an absolutely ruined state. Of course, if you know what happens at the end of Dead Space 1, you can understand why. And they end up discovering on this ship, all the horror and the gore that was left over from the events of Dead Space 1, like the bloodstained walls and everything. They're like, what the heck happened here? And they end up discovering shards of the marker that Isaac encountered. And then you end up having a couple of storylines taking place. You have like the main group that's still trying to figure out what they can do with the ship. Hopefully they can make their biggest deal yet on salvaging this ship. Whereas you have others stealing marker shards in order to basically sell them out to the government for a quick buck there too. And that's when EarthGov comes back into the picture and starts basically revives or is given what it's needed to revive the marker research projects. And that's basically how it snowballs into the events of Dead Space 2, which we return back to Isaac Clarke's story. But this is how you find out how the Ishimura ended up at the location of Dead Space 2, which is the Sprawl or Titan Station, that city I mentioned earlier. So you learn how the Ishimura got there, how it was rediscovered, and how the marker project was revived, pretty much. And it's got some pretty nasty pictures in here, I will say, because not only do the Magpies have to contend with the competition, they also have to contend with EarthGov agents causing trouble, basically killing everybody because, no witnesses. And on top of all that, you have Necromorphs reviving because, as it turns out, marker shards are just as capable of doing what a fully formed marker can do. As it's put in one of the animated movies, like a hologram, you can shatter it, and each piece maintains the exact same characteristics of the original. And one little detail I forgot to mention, one of the effects that the marker has on the minds of certain people is it's able to communicate with them. by using hallucinations of dead friends and relatives. Basically, the marker uses these incarnations, if you will, to guide people towards a certain goal that the marker has. And it's really sick and twisted how it does it, but it really does through and through mess with your mind in ways that you couldn't possibly imagine. But they do a great job at showcasing that in the game series as well. So moving on to our last book that I have here, and a little preface to this, I don't have all of the Dead Space books that exist because I was late to the party on some of them. So there's definitely some books that aren't represented here. But this one right here is Dead Space Liberation, which is yet another graphic novel. And it takes place in between the events of Dead Space 2 and Dead Space 3. So it follows the storyline of characters Ellie Langford, John Carver, and Captain Norton. Now, Ellie, you are introduced to in Dead Space 2. She kind of becomes a bit of a love interest to Isaac Clarke after the tragic events of Dead Space 1. I won't go into all that so I don't spoil it. Um, but basically, this trio is trying to navigate the world and figure out what they need to do in order to stop the marker threat. And the ultimate goal of the markers still has yet to be revealed at this point. That's not revealed until Dead Space 3. But at this point, you have countless different marker research sites, each with their own markers and replication sites across the stars. And some close enough even to be on Earth's moon. Like it's that close to Earth now. Whereas, it used to be like all the way to Saturn or all the way to Aegis 7, which is a star system in deep space. That's where Dead Space 1 takes place. But the marker threat's getting bigger. The Unitology Church is becoming even more of a problem than what they already were in Dead Space 1 and 2. And they're starting to make their moves. They're attacking marker research sites and liberating markers, which is basically creating necromorph outbreaks on all of these different sites. And, at this point, Titan Station and the Sprawl has also fallen to one of these outbreaks. And so it's just getting closer and closer to Earth. Things are getting really dire, and our characters here are trying to stop things from happening. But you also discover new locations from the Sovereign Colonies era that we didn't previously know about that also have markers that were used in experiments. And we learn that the Sovereign Colonies government discovered a parent signal in space to that of the marker signal, one that they believe is the source of all markers. So they think that this parent signal is going to lead them to the marker homeworld. So it basically ends with Ellie jumping into hyperspace pretty much. So it's called shock space in Dead Space. Um, to this unknown destination to see if the rumors are actually true. Is this actually the marker homeworld? Whereas our remaining two characters, John Carver and Norton, and a couple of other characters that you meet in Dead Space 3 along with these two when they're first introduced, they have to now go and search out for Isaac Clarke because Isaac is having a rough go of it at this point. He has the PTSD and the dementia like effects of the marker affecting his mind from Dead Space 1. And then he's enslaved by the government for 3 years and experimented on, quite literally was put into a machine that would stab your eye with a needle to activate the part of his brain where the marker codes were stored so they could make more markers, only to be thrown into another necromorph outbreak on Titan Station. And then he finally gets to escape that with Ellie. And at this point, he is just done with everything. And he is just trying to live out the rest of his life in what little bit of peace he can ascertain. And he just doesn't want to mess with any of this crap anymore. And at the end of this one, you have John Carver and Norton basically searching him out in order to bring him back into the game, if you will. That way, they can hopefully reconnect with Ellie at some point because they think that'll be the thing that actually gets Isaac to come back into it, and to hopefully, through Isaac, stop all the markers once and for all. Because at this point in the story, Isaac Clarke is the only person, through sheer will of his mind, is the only one that has actually destroyed and truly destroyed a marker up to this point. So they really need him in order to accomplish this final goal. But that's all the books in this book review here. And I hope you guys enjoy this series and even look into some of the animated films and heck, even the game series, because it's such a rich story and lore and architecture. The locations are stunning. They really put everything they possibly could into this series. And last year, the Dead Space 1 video game even got a remake where they basically took the original story but added things to it, changed the layout of some of the locations and all that. But they did it in such a perfect way, and they actually incorporated things from Dead Space 2 and 3 and onward, etc., and other installments in the series that weren't previously known up to that point in the Dead Space franchise, and basically retrofitted it into the Dead Space 1 storyline. So it was really cool to see those added details. And another fun fact is they got the voice actor for Isaac, who didn't come into the series until Dead Space 2. They got him to reprise his role this many years later as Isaac in Dead Space 1. So it was kind of neat to see his character become full circle, because in the original Dead Space 1 game, the character was mute and didn't get his voice till Dead Space 2. So yeah, it's such a fun series to go through, and I really enjoyed it. So that's all for this video. I'm gonna close with a little bit of an announcement for the channel. Made a pretty sizable purchase yesterday. So hopefully before April, I'm hoping, that's my optimistic projection here, we'll be able to start doing some gaming videos, I hope. But hopefully all will go well with that. I mean, if it's any indicator how all the troubleshooting process has been for all these simpler videos, it's going to be a whole lot more trial and error to accomplish this part. So we'll see how everything goes. Y'all wish me luck, and hope everyone has a great day.